I thought a loaf of bread could only fill a belly, not a bank account, until the day my family's last crumbs turned into millions. I'm Esther Novak, Essie to those who've stuck around. And at 74, I've got a story that starts with dough-stained fingers and ends in a fortune baked from heartbreak. It was 35 years ago in Toledo, Ohio, a steel town where the mills coughed smoke and the streets sagged under the weight of hard times. That spring, my life shattered. Joe, my husband, had welded beams at the plant for 20 years, his calloused hands keeping our little world spinning. Me, him, our son Ben, 16, and our daughter Sarah, 13. But the recession swept through like a cold wind, slashing jobs, and Joe was cut loose. We scraped by on savings until his heart gave out. Stress, the doctor said, carved it hollow. By the time the bank taped a foreclosure notice to our peeling front door, we were down to a few coins and a cupboard bare as a winter branch. I stood in our kitchen that day, the paper shaking in my grip, the kids watching me like I had answers I didn't. Ben leaned against the counter, his dark hair falling over eyes that hadn't smiled in months, while Sarah sat curled in a chair, her knees to her chest, silent. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice wobbling like a bad lie, but inside I was crumbling. I'd been sewing for neighbors since Joe got sick. Hems, patches, $1 here and there, but it couldn't touch the debt. The oven hulkied in the corner, unused since I'd baked Joe's favorite bread, a recipe from my grandma. Thick, honey-sweet loaves he'd called better than gold. "Maybe I'll bake again," I mumbled, half dreaming, and Sarah's head lifted, a flicker of light in her hazel eyes. I pulled out the recipe book, its spine cracked, pages soft with age, and found that bread, flour, yeast, a touch of honey. As I ran my finger over the ink, a note slipped free, Joe's scrawl, written years back. "Essie, if we ever get ahead, open a bakery. Your bread's worth more than steel." Tears stung my eyes, his faith cutting through the years. I looked at Ben, kicking the cabinets in quiet fury, and Sarah, waiting for me to move. "We're selling bread," I said louder, a spark catching. "Tomorrow at the market." Ben rolled his eyes. "Who's buying that junk?" But Sarah nodded, small and fierce. That night, I kneaded dough by a dim bulb, the yeast's tang waking ghosts of Joe tearing into a warm loaf, grinning. My hands faltered, fear, grief, but I shaped those loaves, baked them golden, and stacked them in a crate. We'd set up a rickety table, a sign. "Essie's bread, 50 cents. The bank could take the walls, but not this. Not my kids, not the fight Joe left in me. It was crumbs, but it was ours." The months after Joe went cold were a slog through flour and frayed hope in that Toledo kitchen. He'd been our anchor, welding steel by day, laughing with the kids by night, while I'd stitched seams to pad our life. But the mill's collapse broke him, the layoff stripping his pride, and his heart quit one bleak November dawn, leaving me with 2 kids and a house sinking in debt. I'd picked up the needle full time, mending shirts, patching jeans for $1 apiece. But it was like bailing a boat with a spoon. Ben grew lanky and quiet, Sarah's chatter dulled, and I'd lie awake, tracing ceiling cracks, counting losses instead of cash. The bread was my desperate grab at something solid. I'd drag those loaves to the Saturday market, Sarah trailing with her shy smile, Ben lagging like he'd rather be anywhere else. A few folks bit. Old Mr. Hensley swore it tasted like home. But most passed by, and we'd limp home with $1 or $2, enough for beans but not the bank. One rainy afternoon, I misjudged the oven. Smoke poured out, the kitchen reeked of ash, and I pulled out a tray of charred lumps. "Toledo's finest baker," I snorted, fanning the haze, and Sarah giggled, but Ben just stared, his jaw tight. "Waste of time," he muttered, kicking a chair. He'd been slipping since Joe died, 16 and adrift, skipping school, stumbling in late with shadowed eyes. I'd sniff for liquor or weed, find nothing, but dread gnawed me. Where you going? I'd demand, and he'd shrug. Around. One night, after that burnt batch, he snapped. This bread's a joke, Mom. We're broke, and you're fiddling with dough like it'll save us. I bristled, slamming a bowl down. I'm trying, Ben. You could pitch in instead of sneaking off. Joe'd be ashamed. His face darkened. Don't bring him into this. You don't get me, you never did. He grabbed his jacket, ignoring Sarah's "Ben, don't," and bolted, the door banging shut like a thunderclap. He didn't come back. Whispers trickled in. He'd hitched to Cleveland, crashing in flop houses, washing dishes or worse to scrape by. I pictured him gaunt, strung out, and hated myself, too harsh, too weak, too lost to hold him. Sarah and I pressed on, her small hands kneading beside mine, but the silence grew thick, the house a shell. One dusk, sifting flour, I found Joe's note again. Your bread's worth more than steel. Not yet, I whispered, tears smudging the words. Ben was gone, maybe for good, but I couldn't stop. Not with Sarah's quiet faith, not with Joe's echo urging me on. We'd bake, sell, cling to what we had, even if it was just us against the dark. 10 years limped by in Toledo, each day a battle to keep the flour flying and the roof over our heads. Sarah and I had carved out a fragile foothold with Essie's bread, a rented shack turned bakery, its warped counter holding loaves that sold just enough to stall the bank. I'd bake before sunrise, hands aching, while Sarah hustled after school, her voice luring a handful of regulars who'd part with $1 for my honeyed bread. But the shack groaned in the wind, the oven coughed smoke, and the debt clung like damp dough. Ben haunted me. 10 years since he'd bolted at 16, his absence a wound that wouldn't heal. Whispers painted him a wreck in Cleveland. Dishes, drugs, dead ends. And I'd wake sweating, seeing his face hollowed out, blaming myself for driving him off with my sharp tongue and broken hope. One brisk October afternoon, as I shaped a loaf, the shack's door squeaked open, and a man stepped in, tall, wiry, bearded, with flour dusting his worn jacket. He lugged a suitcase, and the scent of yeast hit me like a memory. I dropped the dough, spatula clattering, heart pounding. Ben, I rasped, voice cracking. His eyes, Joe's eyes, locked on mine, steady but shadowed. Sarah yelped, a tray slipping from her hands with a crash. What are you doing here? I snapped, stepping forward, anger surging over shock. Come to rub it in. Show off whatever you've been chasing while we've been starving. He didn't flinch, just set the case down, calm as stone. Open it, Mom, he said, voice low. I glared, fists clenched. Why should I? You ditched us. 10 years, not a word, and now you waltz in like nothing. Sarah touched my arm, whispering, please, and I relented, flipping the latch with a grunt. Inside lay recipe cards, a gleaming bread knife, and a ledger, Chicago Bread Company, pages thick with sales figures, thousands deep. What's this game? I demanded, kicking a stool aside, the thud echoing. Still breaking things, he said, a faint grin tugging his lips, and Sarah's nervous laugh pierced the air. Explain now. I barked, voice rising, tears burning. You leave us to die, and this is your excuse? He squared his shoulders, unflinching. I didn't leave you. I washed dishes in Cleveland, slept in alleys, then hitched to Chicago. Worked under a chef who saw grit in me. Took your bread, Mom, learned it right, built that. He tapped the ledger. A bakery, ours. It's thriving, and I'm here to lift us out. Sarah sobbed, hands over her mouth, and I staggered back, the fight leaching out. He hadn't run to ruin. He'd run to rise, grinding through years I'd misjudged. Why hide it? I choked, voice small. Thought you'd hate me, he said, soft. Had to make it real first. The shack pulsed with his words, and I saw Joe's stubborn spark in him. My boy back to bake us whole. The decade after Ben's return flew like yeast in warm dough. We poured his Chicago savvy into Essie's bread, turning that shack into a bakery with brick walls and humming ovens. Ben's recipes, honey rye walnut swirls, drew lines out the door, then contracts from stores, then a chain called Novak's bread that stretched from Toledo to the coasts. Sarah, quick and fierce, tracked every dime, her teenage grit sharpening into a business mind that outpaced mine. I baked beside them, hand steady now, molding loaves like I'd molded us, flawed, tough, golden. From crumbs, we built millions. The bank faded, the house grew, and our name shone on boxes in every state. Toledo's steel might have rusted, but our flour held firm. One still evening, I sat in our new kitchen, wide bright, yeast in the air, watching Ben shape a loaf, his hands deft and sure. Sarah hunched over a ledger, pencil scratching, her hair catching the light. Ever think we'd make it? I asked, voice worn but warm. Ben dusted flour off, grinning faint. Not when I was scrubbing pans in Chicago. Slept in a broom closet, sneaking your recipe after shifts. Burned half a dozen before I got it right. I chuckled, the sound soft. Guess we're a pair, me torching batches here, you there. Sarah looked up, smirking. Good thing I didn't inherit the fire hazard gene. She paused, then slid the ledger aside, her voice dropping. Remember that winter, Mom? No heat, just us under blankets, eating stale heels 'cause we couldn't sell 'em. I nodded, the memory sharp, her small body shivering, my arms tight around her, promising we'd get through. You kept me going, I said, eyes stinging. Every day you smiled, I baked. She reached over, squeezing my hand, and Ben watched quiet. Those Chicago nights, he said, rolling dough flat. I'd see Dad, hear him say, keep at it, kid. Kept me from breaking. I leaned closer, brushing his arm, flour smudging my sleeve. You carried him, and us, I said, voice thick. He nodded, Joe's fire in his eyes, and I felt it. The weight of his closet days, Sarah's cold nights, all kneaded into this. Family isn't about never crumbling. It's the hands that reshape you when you do. I thought Ben had shattered us, but he'd forged us anew, baking millions from my mistakes. Resilience isn't loud. It's a boy in a closet perfecting a loaf, a girl smiling through hunger, a mother trusting too late. Ever think someone's lost, only to find they've kneaded your future from scraps? That's us, bread-breaking millionaires, risen on love and flour.